Good afternoon. Thank you for being here. My name is Ranjana Srivastava, and I'm a medical oncologist. I'm also an author. Some of you may have heard me now and then on ABC Radio with John Fain. It's my absolute privilege to be here today in conversation with Kate Richards. Kate and I went to university together and lost contact with each other, and about 10 or 15 years later, my publisher from Penguin, Andrea, said to me, your colleague Kate is writing a book, and I'm looking after the book. And there were about half a dozen Kates in my class, but there was only one Ranjana Srivastava. So Kate remembered me, and I said, which Kate? Which of the 6 or so Kates? So anyway, when Kate's book came out, I immediately recognized Kate, and Kate and I have been in conversation a few times now, and it's so wonderful to be connected like this. So thank you for being here. It's going to be a very interesting hour. Before I begin speaking with Kate, I just wanted to say a few words. So having spoken with Kate a few times now, what I most enjoy about interviewing her is that she's not afraid to tackle some really difficult questions about mental health. I'm not only an oncologist, I also work in general medicine, and I look after a lot of mentally ill patients who come through our medical wards. And I've always thought while looking after these patients that there are some fairly uncomfortable and sensitive questions, and I'm never quite sure whether to ask them or not. I feel as if I might upset a patient or their carer if I ask them. At the same time, I feel that I can never get a complete insight into the person if I can't. So the first thing to say is that if you find some of my questions a little bit too sensitive or confronting, hopefully they won't be of a personal nature to you. There is plenty of help available for all of us who are battling with mental health issues, and Kate's wonderful book has them listed in the back. But also I would like to say that I have Kate's permission to ask the questions that I think not only trouble me sometimes, but probably a number of people. So with that, let's get started. Kate, you begin the book very dramatically with describing an episode of self-harm, one of several episodes. Do you want to tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Ranjana, and hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. It's wonderful. Thank you to the Wheeler Centre as well. I think in starting the book, really, I suppose the book starts one evening about 18 years ago now, when I was very unwell and had been having a lot of very intrusive kind of hallucinatory experiences, as well as becoming quite fixed on the idea that for some reason that is now a bit fuzzy to me, I had to cut off my right arm. And this idea kind of percolated for a while, but it became stronger and stronger and stronger until it was really, I think, probably all that I was thinking about. To the point where, because I was so unwell and obviously not thinking rationally, I came up with the idea that it was actually the right thing to do, that it was somehow some kind of penance, and that the pain and suffering would connect me with a kind of universal human pain and suffering, which I'm very aware now sounds totally bizarre, and it was. But I did then one evening actually make the attempt and got sort of halfway, I suppose, before there was so much blood and so on that I stopped, thankfully. So in starting the book, I think I had a number of discussions with my publisher and some of my writing peers about it being, because it is a really confronting, I think, way to begin writing a memoir. But I sort of felt, well, this was my reality, and what I'm hoping to be able to do with the book is take people right inside that experience in the present moment, so that you sort of are alongside me while I'm having these thoughts and so on. And so we decided to go ahead with that as the beginning.
Which you do beautifully. And, you talk a lot about Henry and Rose, who were the two people who were in your mind. And I must say, Henry and Rose are as alive to me reading a book as they were to you, and yet it's so bizarre.
Yeah, it's that ultimate. I mean, I really do think that in some ways mental illness is the most complex of all our ailments as human beings, because the illness affects those parts of your brain and mind, and sometimes your personality and your soul, and it all gets mixed up together, and you do come up with some really quite unusual ideas. And one of mine was that there were people that lived in my head, and these people had personalities of their own, and they had ideas of their own and opinions of their own, and most of them were very sort of destructive.
And they were belittling of you.
Yeah, very much so. But two of them were the opposite, and they were Henry and Rose, and they were quite beautiful, gentle souls. And I think when finally I found the right combination of medication and therapy to actually start to get better in any kind of long-term way, for a number of months I missed them, because they had become kind of companions and sources of, I suppose, warmth, and they were a respite from the other things that were happening to me as a result of the illness. And so they were, for me, experiencing that. It was very much just as if they were, friends or relatives, even though obviously they were conjured up in my mind and they never really existed.
So, Kate, when I was coming in today, I said to a friend of mine that I was interviewing you, showed him the book, and his first question to me was, she must have had a very disturbed childhood. And that's really interesting, because I think when we encounter people with a mental illness, we automatically feel that there must be some thread, some connection to the past, or something traumatic that has happened that leads to mental illness, and we look very hard for it. And yet, I've met your parents, who are just the most wonderful, supportive, warm parents one could ask for. Yeah. I've studied in university with you, and you were the non-troublemaker who always attended the tutorials, who sat quietly, took notes, did all the right things. Yeah. And that's why I think it really came as a shock to me to hear the sort of things that you were going through as a medical student, to which we were all oblivious while we sat in a tutorial with you. So speak to us, speak a little bit about sort of your upbringing and whether you feel that there was any connection to what happened.
Yeah, it's an interesting and important question, I think, because for a lot of the people certainly that I was in hospital with, I wouldn't say a lot, but certainly for a good number of them, they had some really difficult things happen to them in the past, whether that be as a child or as an adolescent or both. And those things, I think they certainly have an impact on who you become as an adult. I mean, I can't see how they could fail to. And in some cases, that kind of incredibly stressful, traumatic sort of event can trigger an episode of mental illness in someone who has the, I think, underlying vulnerability. And there's certainly some people in my extended family who've been unwell. So I sort of consider that there's probably some genetic linking going on there that I've inherited. Certainly for me, I grew up on a farm out on the other side of the Dandenong Ranges, and it was heaven. I mean, heavenly, really.
Sounds idyllic.
Yeah. I had horses and we had cattle, and my dad grew carrots and beans, and up the back of our property we had a sort of probably about 10 acres of native virgin forest that hadn't been logged in any recent time, and that was a place of beauty and solitude, and a place for me to go and think, I think, and probably contemplate a lot, and became a kind of haven. So, you know, and I went to an ordinary school and had ordinary friends, and so all of those key things were really just like any other ordinary family, I suppose.
And in retrospect, were there people like Henry and Rose in your upbringing somewhere that came to life when you became mentally ill, do you think?
No, but probably they arose from reading. I think they came probably from characters in kind of an amalgamation of characters in books.
Okay.
So reading was always my greatest joy as a child, and one of the greatest gifts I think my parents have ever given me was that right from the age of sort of 6 months old, even though I was probably wriggling around and not taking much notice, they read to me every day, every morning and every night, and right up until the age of sort of 10 or 11, you know, and from that I think I inherited an absolute reverence for literature, and I think a lot of my kind of solace during episodes of illness and in between episodes of illness came from reading, fiction in particular and poetry. And I think probably Henry and Rose are a kind of amalgamation of a number of characters, yeah.
Kate, I will never forget the day that I got into medicine. I think it was one of the most momentous occasions in my life. You obviously studied medicine and then had to give up your career as a clinician, or in fact never quite got to start it.
Correct,
Talk
yes.
a little bit about that and how it made you feel.
I think I went through a grieving process in a lot of ways, because I got to the end of 6th year and somehow passed all of our final exams. So I had that, you know, graduation and things. And then when my friends were setting out on their real careers as doctors and, you know, choosing where they would go for their internships and what they would study and so on, I realised that it was just, there was no way I was going to be able to get through an internship, partly because by that stage I understood that if my sleep-wake cycle got out of sync, I very rapidly became unwell. And part of any early doctor's career is 3 months here and there on night shift. It's working very long hours under a lot of pressure. And I really felt, and still think, that that would be an enormous risk for me for becoming unwell again. And not only for me, but I couldn't conscience the idea of becoming unwell and then that affecting any patients that I might come into contact with who I felt I was responsible for. So that's a personal decision.
Yeah.
I would hasten to say that there are many, many fantastic clinicians out there who are very well managing depression or bipolar disorder or anxiety or a past history of an eating disorder, all sorts of things, and they do it beautifully. But I just felt that that it wasn't going to be right for me. Having said that, I do still grieve quite often, particularly when I see my close friends from uni sort of doing well with their careers, and I suppose they have that financial security as well that I don't have. And
an impoverished writer, you mean?
Absolutely. And I do think that I probably at some level have something to offer as a clinician, but unfortunately I just couldn't fit it into the way we train our young doctors, and probably even the way one needs to practice as a clinician, because you really, I mean, it's rigorous, and you need to have that sort of intellectual functioning, working as highly as possible all the time, but you also need to have a sense of balance, I think, within yourself. And I don't always have that, so...
I must say that I found your remarkable generosity towards potential patients very heartwarming, to say that you would step back from clinical medicine in order to not harm others, and I thought that was wonderful. And when I hear you speak now and at various forums, I think medicine needs more people like you to be able to educate doctors about more issues than just the patient being a diagnosis. Staying with the medical profession for a moment, because this is something that I particularly found quite ashamed about, I think, in a way, is you describe being dumped by your psychiatrist, and you describe a number of encounters with the profession which were just really awful and sad and troubling. And it made me wonder whether doctors and psychiatrists treated you worse because when you became ill, it was a sign of our vulnerability as a profession. What do you think?
Yeah, so it's such an interesting question, and I obviously can't say how it was for those individuals who were treating me, and whether that was something that troubled them. I think they expected me to have a depth of understanding about what was happening to me and a degree of insight just because I'd studied medicine. And it became very clear to me once I sort of kind of came through a number of those inpatient episodes that it doesn't matter what someone's educational background is, what someone's cultural or social background is. We really can't expect a sick mind, as mine was then, to heal a sick mind. So I think they often seemed to assume that I had more insight than I did, or assumed that I had a deeper understanding of the consequences of my behaviour than I did when I was unwell. And they then seemed to get particularly frustrated when I didn't, say, take up their suggestions or take my medication in the way I should have. And so I think there was that. But yeah, I mean, I do think that that part of the culture in medical schools and amongst groups of clinicians is very much that as a profession they are a little bit infallible, and perhaps that they were seeing me, I guess, in a locked unit, really at the bottom of life. Despite having done very well at uni, maybe that was something that they hadn't kind of been brought up against or had to look fully in the face before. Yeah.
And the undercurrent of humanity that runs through this book especially comes across when you talk about your psychologist, Winsome, whom I've met and who's a remarkable woman. Yeah. Tell us a little bit about how you ended up sort of veering away from the psychiatrists a little bit towards Winsome and the relationship you formed with her.
I think I came to the conclusion that there had to be more to the recovery process than taking X milligrams of drug A in the morning, X milligrams of drug B in the evening. And so I started to look for someone who valued, yes, the medication, but also that I think part of recovery from all illness, but particularly from mental illness, is about addressing what I tend to think of as the whole person. And so I think this idea of a biopsychosocial model is kind of bandied around in psychiatry, but I think a lot of psychiatrists don't actually practice it on a daily basis. And so I was looking for someone who perhaps valued the mind and the body and whatever concept a patient may have of their spiritual life, of their soul, of a sense of wonder and awe, equally. And I was able to identify that there were problems that part of my problems stemmed not just from a chemical imbalance in the mind or in the brain, but there were other things that needed some healing as well. And I stumbled across Winsome. It was luck, really, and I think we had weekly sessions for 5 years, and I think there are a couple of things that were more important than anything else. One was that she always had an immense sense of compassion for me, and I think I say in the book that kind of professional compassion isn't love and it isn't pity. It's a kind of reaching out from one human being to another and finding that essential human connection. And we never spoke about it in these kind of terms. It was just something that I felt. Also that her consulting room was a place of safety for me, so that no matter how I turned up, in what state of dishevelment or drunk on some occasions, or just recently released from the locked inpatient unit at my local public hospital, it didn't change how she was present for me in the room. So I felt that I could bring all of the horrible mess of my mind there, and she would never judge that or never kind of weigh up that in a way that I think for all of us, particularly who've suffered something like depression, one of the things that goes along with it is a tremendous sense of guilt for letting people down, for letting yourself down, for not turning up to things, for missing things or not behaving in the best possible way that we can. And so when that's kind of thrown up at someone in the consulting room, I think it just magnifies that sense of shame and guilt. And Winsome never ever did, never once, no matter what. And so it got to the point where I could start to share with her the really deep stuff that I hadn't shared with anyone before. And she said to me one day that she felt that on an intellectual level I understood that I had a mental illness, but on an emotional level I still hadn't accepted it. And until I was able to kind of marry those things together, that I'd sort of keep lurching from crisis to crisis. So, and I think she was right.
And you write beautifully about the fact that I think that the medical profession was trying to get you to see this intellectually.
Yes.
And to see that, these drugs taken at this time were going to help. And certainly there is a very big role for medical treatment and for medicines in mental illness.
Yes.
But it seems that what Winsome gave you is empathy and silence and respect. Yes. And it seems to me that it was at least half your therapy, if not more.
Yeah, it really was. And having now spoken to so many people who've been under the care of one kind of mental health professional or another, it doesn't really seem to matter whether that person's a GP, a social worker, a case manager, a psychologist or a psychiatrist. That human connection, that therapeutic relationship, it's just as important, I think, as taking the medication, which is not to say that, the way Winsome looks at it, and I agree with her, is that the medication gets you to a point of stability where you can then engage effectively in therapy.
And begin to unpack
some of that stuff. But it was really interesting. I was on the ABC Compass program last month, and Professor Ian Hickey from the Brain and Mind Institute was there, and Geraldine Doog said to him, so, Ian, how often do you ask or talk to your patients about their spiritual life? Or how often do you inquire whether they have a belief in a god or in, or like a religious. Is religion a part of their lives, or is there a spiritual identity that they consider important? And he couldn't remember ever asking that. And I think that's just a small example of what I found missing in the psychiatric the psychiatrists that I'd had dealing with.
Speaking of therapeutic relationships, I think one of the misconceptions, I would say, people have, and I certainly also see in the hospital system, is that you never imagine psych patients supporting each other.
Yeah.
You sort of have this view that everyone is in their own little environment, often with their own thoughts, they're getting treatment, they go in and out, and yet, once again, you write evocatively about some of the people you met who sound like wonderful human beings who are troubled but still have time for you.
Yeah.
Tell us about that.
It's interesting, I think, that certainly in my personal experience, friendships between fellow patients in the psych wards is sort of frowned upon by the staff. And I'm quite sure that they may... that they're coming from an objective kind of place, and maybe they can see things that we can't. But some of the most beautiful and enduring friendships that I now have, or two in particular, are from people that I met, fellow patients in the inpatient psych unit. And I think the reason I think these friendships, even if they only last for the 4 weeks that two people are in that unit together, is that there's some kind of deep understanding of what we're all going through that is very difficult, perhaps impossible, for people who've never experienced an episode of mental illness to have.
Sure.
So we could connect in a different way. And, of course, for the most part, unless we were particularly unwell, we could chat to each other without there being any kind of retribution or judgment shown. And we could cry with each other and laugh with each other and moan and groan with each other and talk about, the medication side effects and whatever else it might be, our families.
And you inhabited the same space,
yeah,
I guess.
Yeah. And I certainly don't mean everyone sits around in a lovely warm group and it's all wonderful. But I mean, you can certainly find fellow like-minded folk in a psych unit, just as you can at work or,
sounds like good
in a supporting club or whatever. Yeah.
Kate, time's running out and my mind is spilling with questions, but I do have one more final question for you before we'll invite some audience questions. You have been well for quite some years now, and yet you alluded to the fact that you can never be sure. I wanted to find out a little bit about how you keep yourself well and what the future holds for you.
Keeping well is still a bit of a daily exercise, and I guess it probably always will be. There are good days and bad days, and we all have good days and bad days, and part of me staying well is remembering that. And so I think the first step for me is taking the medication that I'm on that works beautifully as prescribed, rather than as I used to do, which was decide whether I felt like taking it or not.
The non-compliant
That's
patient,
right.
The dreaded non-compliant.
Oh, terrible. And being very aware of having what I call quiet time or time to kind of recharge, I suppose, in a way that I have found is really important. And, the little things that we all are grappling with, which is managing that day-to-day stress and managing commitments with work and home and so on. And having, I think the other important thing is that I've got supports in place particularly my GP now, who I really trust and respect and admire. And if ever things start to get a bit wobbly, I have someone to turn to quickly. I also have a kind of action plan, just like someone with diabetes or asthma might have an action plan, and that includes what to do if things really spiral out of control, who to call.
Sure. And you've written about that in your second book, Is There No Place for Me?
Yeah.
Kate, I might stop myself there and practice some self-discipline and turn to the audience for some questions.
Hello, Kate.
Hello.
Thank you very much for today's talk. It's been terrific. I also listened to the podcast of your interview at the recent Adelaide Writers' Festival, which was with another clinician as well. So very interesting dialogue there as well. I'm just wondering, I know in that interview at Adelaide you said you are working on another book, and that I thought you've taken this brave step of stepping away from your desired career of medicine for very sound reasons. But I'm wondering what else you are doing with your writing career, and whether you do any teaching or speaking as well. So if you could tell us a little about that.
I think I'm always writing because it's my greatest joy. It's the thing that gives me the most meaning, and I'm writing. It's my first foray into long-form fiction, so I'm writing a novel that's set in the alpine wilderness of southeastern Australia, which is a place up around Mount Kosciuszko, but kind of right out from where all the roads are, right into that kind of wilderness that's really one of the only places kind of untouched in some ways by us, and that's an enormous challenge, and I think it certainly gets me out of bed every morning. It doesn't pay the bills, and that's the endless challenge that I think all of us whose greatest love and dream to have a career in the creative arts, the endless challenge is then trying to make ends meet financially. And so that's something I'm up against, as we all are. And but I do feel incredibly grateful and thrilled that I do have the opportunity to try writing a novel, and I do hope that one day it might be out there in bookshops. But you know,
I'm sure it will be, and we'll be back here.
but that and poetry. And sorry, very briefly, yes, I am speaking at as many kind of groups of clinicians, particularly trainee psychiatrists, medical students, mental health units, and writers' festivals and groups. And they have a different bent. Some of them are more about the writing process, and some of them are more about mental health and mental illness. And I love that.
Hi, Kate.
Yes, hi.
It strikes me as incredibly brave of you to delve back into these experiences and write about them when you'd worked really hard to be well. And I'm curious how that process was for you, and what motivated you to undertake it.
There were days when it was incredibly hard, because to bring it to life on the page, I did have to do exactly what you're saying. I had to go back and really inhabit that really dark, quite terrifying time in my life. And there were certainly evenings where I kind of looked at the laptop and looked at where I was up to and just thought, I can't face that. But on the other hand, what I found was that even if I delved back there for 3 or 4 hours, when I sort of saved the file and shut down the computer, I could return to my ordinary, balanced place in life, and I wasn't stuck in that horror as it was sometimes. And so that was, I think, really important and helpful. But in the end, what I wanted to try and do was was to really put down what it's like to be very unwell, to have that kind of disabling sorrow or the bewilderment or the anger or whatever it might be in the present tense, so that people reading it, rather than having someone looking back in time, or rather than the book being written by a therapist or by my parents or friends, I thought if I could really help people to get a sense of what it's like in the moment, then it would be worth me having to go through those small periods of going back there, and I think it was.
Kate, that was an excellent question, and I just wanted to follow on from that. Did anyone, perhaps out of concern for your well-being, suggest that perhaps you should not write this book, like Winsome or your parents? And was there a period where you thought that perhaps your insight into whether you should write about this or not was adequate?
That's really interesting. I hadn't thought about that. Winsome was absolutely encouraging all the way through, as were all my family and friends, which was really wonderful. It was incredibly important to have their support. I studied the diploma of professional writing and editing at RMIT, and a couple of my teachers did pull me aside and say they felt that this was such a big undertaking on so many levels. You know, did I really feel that it was worth it, and how would I manage if, say, there was some really I suppose negative reviews, or if nobody ever bought the book, or whatever might happen. And so that was good, because it meant that I thought through all of that stuff before the book came out, and kind of had some ways in the back of my head that I might manage those kinds of things. So, but yeah, in terms of insight, I never really considered it, I don't think.
Don't consider it now, it's okay.
It's too late.
Hello. Thank you, Kate, for coming and speaking. I just had a question about how you sort of separate your identity from mental illness. Like, do you find it hard to be a spokesperson and advocate for your experiences but still have a sense of yourself separate from your illness?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. I would say I don't separate them really. I still feel very aware that if I stop taking all the medication that I need to, and if I went back to drinking 3/4 of a bottle of whiskey every evening, I would probably be very unwell again. So I don't really consider them separate. I guess I sort of think of myself as a spokesperson because I'm currently well, and, you know, coming from a relatively well, ordinary, normal, balanced place. But that doesn't mean that there isn't that part of me that can become unwell. And who knows whether in time I might be unwell again. I always have to keep that in mind. So thanks. That's a really interesting question. I haven't been asked that before, but I suppose I had to merge it together rather than try and keep them separate, because for so long I tried to keep them separate, and it landed me in quite a bit of trouble.
And in a way, that's what Winsome was trying to say to you, is that really this is who you are.
Yeah.
And you need to recognise all aspects of it in order to get better.
Yeah, and Winsome very much said early on that she felt that I was a little bit like a jigsaw, that I was just, scattered parts, and that part of her job, in a very metaphorical sense, was putting those parts together. And I think she was right, and so that for me took a long time to come to that place. Yeah.
Hi, my name's Jenny. Thanks. I loved reading your book. I've lived with hearing voices from about the age of 7 when I experienced a trauma, and it's taken me 50 years to find my authentic self. But my question, and I'd like to try and write my story, and my question is, how every day is a challenge mentally. You're struggling with your voice or what your situation. How did you decide what to put in the book and what to leave out?
I decided very early on that it needed to cover a discrete period of time, that if I tried to cover sort of from the age of, 10 to 35, that it was just going to become this enormous kind of amorphous monstrosity. And so the very first thing I did was decide, right, I'll write from the age of, I think it's about, 21 to 31. And that will be the period that I focus on, and I'll give everything to that period, and referring in backstory to various other things. But that made it manageable because then I had a starting point and a finishing point. So within that period, I tried to include everything, though through the editing process we then removed some stuff just because there was too much. But initially, as a first draft, I wrote everything from the point where I decided to start to the point where I decided I'd finish. And that included particularly the 5 years of being in therapy with Winsome. So the book ends at the point where she and I sort of shake hands and say, well, this has been an amazing experience and thank you and goodbye. And so I started at a place of being very unwell. So that was my process. I hope that's helpful.
And Kate, one of the common sort of pieces of advice that one gives to aspiring writers is essentially you write down everything, and it's the job of a good editor and a good publisher then hopefully to see as to what shines, what makes sense. But it's quite difficult, in fact, to edit yourself as you are writing, and it's one of the major reasons, I suppose, why writers get blocked. Because they're thinking too far ahead. Yeah, very much so. And it's your own story, particularly with memoir. And fiction is different, but certainly it is impossible to be completely objective about your own story and you writing your own story even more so. And so that's why I think for me I'm a member of 2 writing groups, and workshopping pieces within those groups was invaluable because they were also able to identify, like you say, Ranjana, the things that shone and the things that were a bit confusing or perhaps unnecessary. Oh, that are dear to you, but are just not appropriate.
Yeah, exactly. Absolutely, yeah.
I had a few of those too.
Yeah.
What do you mean you're taking this out?
That's right. Kill your darlings, as they say in the literary world. So I think as a first step for anyone starting out with memoir, it is certainly a matter of just putting it all there in the beginning, and then you can go back and work on it to hone it down into something that is interesting to other people who don't know you, because that's the great challenge with memoir. Something might be terribly interesting to you and your family and friends, but you have to think much more broadly than that this is going to be an audience who may never see you in the flesh, never meet you. What can you say that might touch them or make a difference for them?
We're right on 1:30. Maybe time for a final short question.
Two questions within one.
Cheeky.
How can we educate or bring more awareness to the medical establishment regarding spirituality? And how did spirituality support your healing process?
I really hope in time that there'll be a slow changing of that medicalisation culture of humanity from the perspective of medicos. And I think part of it is people like Ranjana, who write the most beautiful essays and shorter pieces for clinicians and for the general public about the importance of the whole person and all of the facets of that person, which includes not only the spiritual life of the patient, but also the spiritual life of the clinician. And if you haven't read Ranjana's Penguin special, Dying for a Chat, please do, because it is addressing exactly this issue, and hopefully it will be something that's mandatory reading in medical schools. So I think, certainly myself and as many other people as can be that are talking about this, programs like the Compass program that was looking at the importance of spirituality in healing and recovery for people who have mental illness. I think slowly it's improving, and I think it will continue to evolve in the right way. For me personally, my spiritual life really exists out in the wilderness because it's a communion with nature rather than a communion with a kind of religious way of looking at God. And it was really through the therapy with Winsome and her identifying that and then allowing me to make that something that's important in my life that I was able to come to a point where I felt good about making it a part of my life, a regular part of my life. And so that's the place where I go to find communion and peace. And so I try to do that as regularly as possible.
Thank you, Kate. That was a lovely note to end on. Ladies and gentlemen, it falls to me to say thank you to Kate for being so open and honest. And every time I speak with Kate, I'm reminded of why we enter medicine. And if you ask any aspiring medical student, any aspiring doctor, the answer is almost always the same: to make a difference. And I know that you will agree with me that although Kate did not end up becoming a clinician, just like thousands of other clinicians, I really feel, Kate, that you're doing us all a tremendous service by writing books and by illuminating us about such an important issue like mental illness. So thank you very much for doing this, and good luck with the future.
Thank you so much, Ranjana. Thank you.